The courtroom was silent except for the hum of an old ceiling fan turning above. Everyone's eyes were fixed on the young woman standing in the center, her hands bound tightly in restraints. Her uniform was wrinkled and marked with signs of wear, her boots still showing salt stains from the sea. She didn't look dangerous, but the guards on either side stood close as if she might do something reckless. Her name was Lena. She had once been one of the youngest naval mechanics in her unit, known for her sharp instincts and quiet dedication. But now she stood accused of disobeying a direct order during a classified mission that had ended in disaster. The air in the room felt heavy. Every creak of the wooden floor echoed as if the walls themselves were listening. Reporters filled the back rows, whispering to each other about the traitor sailor. The story had already spread across news channels for weeks. Some said she had risked an entire crew to save a civilian ship that wasn't supposed to be there. Others believed she had gone rogue, choosing her own moral code over military discipline. Nobody seemed to know what had really happened that night in the South Pacific. Lena stood still, her face calm but unreadable. She didn't look like someone trying to defend herself. Instead, it seemed she had already accepted whatever judgment was coming. A few people in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably, sensing something strange about her silence. Her lawyer, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, leaned close and whispered for her to speak when asked. But Lena just looked down at her hands, the chains catching the light as if to remind her that no words could free her now. The judge, an older man with gray hair and a voice that carried authority, looked at her for a long time before speaking. He asked her to confirm her name and rank. She nodded once and answered softly, barely loud enough to be heard. He then began to read the charges: disobedience, dereliction of duty, destruction of government property, and willful endangerment of personnel. Each word sounded heavier than the last. The courtroom murmured as the judge went on, but Lena didn't flinch. Her lawyer rose to speak, trying to argue that she had acted under extreme circumstances, but he was cut off by the prosecutor, a sharp-voiced woman who had built her career on cases like this. She painted Lena as reckless and arrogant, claiming she had ignored repeated commands to stand down during a critical mission. The prosecutor's voice echoed off the walls as she described how Lena's decision led to a costly loss for the Navy. Her actions weren't bravery, the prosecutor said firmly. They were selfish. She put herself above her command, and now good men are gone because of it. The room buzzed again. A few reporters scribbled notes furiously. Lena stayed silent, her expression steady, though a flicker of pain crossed her eyes when the word "gone" was mentioned. Outside the courtroom, the story had already been written by the world. A young mechanic gone too far, her moral compass misaligned with duty. But inside those walls there were small details no one noticed, like how her uniform still had the faint stitching of a unit patch that no longer existed, or how her eyes drifted toward the naval insignia on the wall, as if remembering something she couldn't say aloud. The first witness was called. A man in a dark blue uniform stepped forward. He had served as her commanding officer during the mission. His voice was tight with emotion as he described how Lena had refused to turn the ship back when ordered. He said she claimed she had detected a distress signal from a civilian vessel nearby. He admitted he never heard the signal himself, but that she had diverted the ship without approval. When he was asked what happened next, his voice cracked slightly. The ship suffered a systems failure, and they were forced to make a hard emergency return. Equipment was damaged and lives were lost during the chaos. He paused before saying, "She was the one at the controls. She made that call." Lena's lawyer stood and asked if he knew what kind of distress call she had picked up. The man shook his head. He said he wasn't aware of any civilian ships in that zone. It was supposed to be restricted waters. The lawyer asked again if it was possible there had been a classified or humanitarian vessel nearby. The witness hesitated, then said quietly that he didn't have clearance for that level of information. The courtroom stirred again, sensing something hidden beneath the surface of all these facts. But Lena said nothing. She didn't confirm or deny anything. Her silence began to frustrate even the judge. The prosecutor turned to her and demanded to know if she had acted out of disobedience or guilt. Lena looked up for the first time. Her eyes were calm but distant, as if she were remembering something from far away. Then she said softly, "I did what I believed was right." That single sentence sent a ripple through the room. The prosecutor tried to press her for more, but Lena wouldn't speak again. Her lawyer looked defeated. The judge sighed, rubbing his temples, and called for a short recess. During the break, the guards led Lena to a small bench near the side wall. She sat quietly, her wrists still bound. The chains had rubbed her skin raw, but she didn't complain. A young officer standing nearby looked at her curiously. He couldn't have been more than 23. And he seemed confused to see someone like her treated as dangerous. He finally asked in a low voice, "Why won't you tell them your side?" Lena didn't answer. Instead, she turned her hand slightly, and for a moment, something under the edge of her sleeve caught the light. A small tattoo, faded and worn just above her wrist. The officer noticed it but didn't recognize what it meant. Before he could ask, a voice echoed from the courtroom doors. "All rise," someone called. The room fell quiet as a tall man entered. His white uniform stood out sharply against the dark wood of the courtroom. His chest carried rows of medals, and his steps were slow but sure. People turned their heads, whispering. He was Admiral Arthur Kane, a respected figure who rarely attended hearings like this. He moved toward the front, giving a brief nod to the judge before sitting beside him. Lena lifted her eyes just long enough to see him. Something in her expression changed, just slightly, but enough for those watching closely to notice. The Admiral looked at her too, his brow furrowing as if trying to place a memory. He leaned toward the judge and whispered something, and the judge nodded. The proceedings resumed. The prosecutor began listing evidence again, pointing to mission logs and communication transcripts that showed Lena ignoring direct orders. The Admiral sat quietly, his gaze fixed on Lena the entire time. After a while, he spoke softly to the judge again, asking to review the mission details. The judge allowed it. The Admiral read through the file, his eyes narrowing. When he looked up again, his expression had changed. He seemed unsettled, even confused. He leaned back, studying Lena's restrained hands. For a moment, the chain shifted and the tattoo on her wrist became visible again. He froze. His face went pale. The numbers and letters inked into her skin weren't random. They were coordinates. Specific ones. He knew them. They belonged to a classified location, one he hadn't thought about in years. His hand tightened slightly around the papers in front of him. He turned to the guards and asked almost quietly, "Why is she restrained?" The prosecutor objected, saying it was for protocol. The Admiral didn't reply. He just kept staring at the tattoo, his mind racing. Finally, he leaned forward and spoke in a voice that carried enough authority to silence the room. "Remove the restraints," he said. The guards hesitated. The judge looked unsure. The prosecutor started to argue, but the Admiral's tone left no room for debate. "That's an order," he said firmly. As the chains were unfastened, the room filled with quiet murmurs. Lena didn't move, her expression unreadable. The Admiral looked at her again, softer now. "Where did you get that tattoo?" he asked. Lena didn't answer, but a faint flicker of recognition crossed her face. The Admiral leaned closer, and for a brief second their eyes met. Something unspoken passed between them, something the rest of the courtroom couldn't begin to understand. When he finally looked away, his jaw was tight. He whispered something to the judge that no one else could hear. The judge nodded slowly, his expression turning serious. Lena sat back quietly, her freed hands resting on the table. She didn't look triumphant or relieved. She just stared ahead, her gaze calm but distant, as if the weight of years had settled over her shoulders again. The Admiral sat in silence, his thoughts elsewhere. He knew now that this case wasn't what it appeared to be. And whatever truth was buried behind those faded numbers on her wrist, it was something that had never been meant to reach a courtroom. The courtroom settled back into an uneasy silence as the recess ended. Lena sat at the table, her hands free now, but her posture remained tense like a coiled spring ready to release at any moment. She didn't move, didn't speak. It was as if the last few minutes hadn't changed anything, even though everyone else could feel the shift in energy. The Admiral had returned to his seat beside the judge, his expression unreadable, but his eyes stayed fixed on Lena. He had seen the tattoo, recognized the coordinates instantly, and something deep inside told him this woman had done more than anyone knew. The prosecutor began again, trying to regain control of the room. She pulled up the mission logs, pointing to timestamps and orders that had been given on the night in question. She said Lena had ignored multiple calls to return to the ship's base. She said she had acted independently, risking the lives of the crew and damaging critical equipment. The words sounded harsh, calculated, meant to paint her as reckless. But there was a difference in the courtroom now. The murmurs from the audience had quieted, replaced by an uneasy curiosity. Something about Lena's calm, silent defiance made people lean forward. They wanted to know what she knew, or what she had done that no one could understand. The first witness returned to the stand, a junior officer who had been on the bridge during the mission. He was nervous, fidgeting with his notes as he spoke. He described the chaos that had unfolded that night. Alarms ringing, systems failing, crew members shouting over the intercom. He explained how Lena had refused the order to return, saying something about a distress call they hadn't detected. The Admiral's eyes narrowed. He whispered something to the judge, who nodded slightly. He asked the officer quietly if he had noticed anything unusual that night. The officer hesitated. He said he had seen Lena checking her console repeatedly, entering coordinates into the navigation system that didn't match the orders. She had ignored repeated commands, he said, but she didn't panic. She stayed calm and focused, as if she knew something the rest of them didn't. The Admiral leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a brief moment. He remembered that night, or at least parts of it. He had been reviewing classified files earlier, thinking he might have misread something. But now it was clear. Lena had intercepted a distress signal from a vessel that shouldn't have been there, a ship carrying civilians with sensitive information. The mission had been secret. Even most of the officers on board had not been cleared to know about it. Lena's actions had saved lives, but she had also violated every rule written in the manual. The judge called for another brief recess. Lena didn't move. She just stared ahead, her face unreadable. The Admiral walked slowly toward her, his footsteps echoing softly on the polished wood floor. He stopped beside her, bending slightly so that she could hear him without anyone else catching the words. "You know what you did?" he said quietly. "I understand." Lena looked up at him for a moment. There was recognition in her eyes, something like relief, but she didn't respond. She didn't have to. The Admiral could see the truth in her gaze. She had carried the weight of this secret for years, and no one had ever understood. Not her superiors, not the investigators, not even the people who had served beside her. The courtroom reconvened, and the second witness was called, a communications officer who had been stationed on the ship's satellite systems. She spoke about signals received that night, coded transmissions that were unusual for the mission. She admitted she hadn't understood them fully at the time. The prosecutor pressed her, trying to suggest negligence. But the Admiral raised his hand, requesting to see the original data. He studied it quietly, his brow furrowed. The signals matched what Lena had said. They came from a civilian vessel carrying encrypted information, someone's lives in danger, hidden in a mission that wasn't supposed to exist. He felt a rush of frustration and admiration at the same time. Lena had acted on instinct, on courage, on a moral compass that overrode orders she had no right to ignore. The judge allowed the Admiral to speak directly to the court. His voice was steady, authoritative, and carried weight. He didn't accuse anyone, but he began to explain the complexities of classified missions and the impossible choices officers sometimes had to make. He didn't reveal everything. The details were too sensitive, but he hinted at the hidden stakes, the unseen dangers that Lena had confronted. The prosecutor tried to counter, insisting that Lena should have reported everything before acting. But the Admiral shook his head. He spoke about the lives at risk, the impossibility of following orders when innocent people were in immediate danger. He didn't excuse her disobedience. He explained it. He painted a picture of courage under pressure, decision-making in the dark, and the weight of responsibility that comes with knowing what others cannot. As he spoke, the room shifted. The audience, the press, even some of the military officers began to lean forward, listening in a way they hadn't before. Lena's silence, her restraint, her calm demeanor, it suddenly made sense. She had carried a secret that could have destroyed her career, and she had acted anyway. The Admiral glanced down at the tattoo on her wrist, now fully visible. He could see every line, every faded number and letter. Each one told a story he could read immediately. He could see the coordinates, the operation name, the very people she had saved. He knew then why she hadn't spoken. Revealing the truth could have endangered lives, exposed a mission that was never supposed to exist. She had chosen silence, and he respected that choice deeply. The judge, noticing the change in the room's atmosphere, allowed Lena to speak if she wished. She hesitated for a long moment, then shook her head slightly. She wasn't ready. She didn't want attention, didn't want recognition. She only wanted to continue her work, to stay quiet, and to know that the people she had saved were safe. The courtroom proceeded with further evidence, mostly technical and procedural. Documents showed failed systems, diverted routes, and equipment damage. But the Admiral interjected when he could, clarifying details, explaining how every decision Lena had made had been calculated, precise, and morally necessary. Slowly, the narrative began to change. The story of reckless disobedience began to look more like a story of calculated courage. Outside the courtroom, the press still wrote their headlines, but inside, a quiet revolution was taking place. People were beginning to understand that this young woman, restrained for months and painted as a traitor, had acted in a way that no manual could teach. She had acted for humanity, for morality, for something beyond orders and regulations. The second witness finished, and the courtroom paused again. The Admiral motioned for a short recess. Lena remained seated, her eyes drifting to the floor. She didn't speak, didn't move. The guards stood close, but they no longer seemed tense. The room had changed in subtle ways. People who had been skeptical now looked at her differently. Respect had begun to replace doubt, though it was quiet, almost invisible. During the recess, the Admiral walked with Lena to a corner of the room. He leaned closer and asked quietly, "Do you understand the weight of what you've done?" Lena nodded, her eyes steady. "I did what I had to do," she said softly. He sighed almost in relief. He had seen many acts of courage in his career, but few carried the moral clarity Lena had. Few had the strength to stand alone against protocol, against the expectations of every officer on board, against the judgment of the world. The courtroom reconvened, and the third witness was called, a civilian engineer who had been rescued during the mission. The young woman walked carefully to the stand. She was nervous, her hands shaking slightly. When asked to describe the night, her voice trembled. She explained how the ship she was on had been stranded, how the crew had been in danger, and how Lena had appeared without warning, taking command in a situation that none of the civilians could have managed alone. The audience listened in awe. Lena's silence and composure now took on a new meaning. She hadn't acted recklessly. She had acted decisively. She had saved lives, and every procedural violation had been secondary to the reality of survival. The Admiral watched, quietly proud. He knew that the civilian testimony alone could change the course of this trial. It would show the court that the young woman, once restrained and doubted, had made choices that reflected courage, integrity, and an unflinching commitment to human life. By the time the third witness finished, the tension in the courtroom had shifted almost completely. The people who had entered the room expecting scandal and disobedience now whispered among themselves about heroism, about courage in the face of impossible odds. Lena, still silent, allowed her gaze to wander to the ceiling, her mind perhaps replaying the mission, the chaos, the decisions she had made alone. The Admiral returned to his seat, the lines of worry on his face softening. He knew the next steps would be delicate. The court would need to weigh procedure against morality, protocol against human life, and rules against the kind of instinct that could only come from someone who had seen the consequences of both obedience and defiance. The first half of the day's proceedings ended quietly. Lena remained calm, her hands resting lightly on the table, the tattoo on her wrist catching the light now and then. It was a small mark, easy to miss, but it carried the weight of truth. A truth no one else could see without knowing what. The courtroom reconvened, the air still heavy with tension but now tinged with curiosity and quiet anticipation. Lena sat at the table, her hands free, the tattoo on her wrist partially exposed. She didn't move much, only occasionally glancing around the room, her calm demeanor contrasting sharply with the chaos that had unfolded years ago. People whispered quietly, their attention now divided between the evidence being presented and the quiet strength emanating from her. Even the prosecutor, determined and unyielding, seemed unsettled. There was a growing sense that the story wasn't as simple as disobedience or recklessness. The next witness was called, a young engineer who had been on the civilian ship that night. She walked carefully to the stand, her uniform plain, her face pale but determined. She cleared her throat and began speaking in a soft voice, explaining the dire situation aboard her ship. They had been stranded, engines failing, alarms ringing, and communication lines dead. The crew was panicked, and the civilians aboard had little training or experience to handle the escalating crisis. The courtroom listened intently. Lena remained still, her eyes fixed on the witness. She didn't speak, didn't react overtly, but her posture carried a subtle tension. It was as if she were reliving the night, frame by frame, silently guiding the story without interrupting. The engineer described the sudden appearance of Lena's ship. She spoke about how Lena had assessed the situation immediately, coordinating the rescue while the civilian vessel was at risk of capsizing. The witness admitted that the crew had initially been suspicious of the naval ship, unsure whether it would help or merely complicate the disaster. But Lena had acted decisively, giving clear orders, positioning the ship, and managing to stabilize the civilians long enough to begin evacuation. The courtroom shifted. The murmurs grew louder. For the first time, people began to see the magnitude of Lena's actions. She hadn't acted recklessly. She had acted under impossible pressure, in a situation no one else had been trained for. Every procedural violation now began to look different. It wasn't defiance, it was courage under pressure. The Admiral watched closely, his eyes narrowing as he studied the witness. He recognized the sequence of events immediately. The coordinates on Lena's tattoo corresponded to the location described by the engineer. Every detail lined up perfectly. He could see the strategic choices Lena had made, the calculated risks, and the moral weight she had carried alone. The prosecutor interjected, pressing the witness for specifics about orders that had been ignored. She asked if Lena had acted without approval, if she had gone against commands that could have prevented further loss. The engineer shook her head, her voice steady now. She said Lena hadn't acted without purpose. Every maneuver, every decision had been necessary to prevent loss of life. Without Lena's intervention, she said, many aboard her ship would not have survived. The courtroom grew silent. Even the judge, whose authority often commanded attention, paused to absorb the testimony. Lena's silence now seemed like a form of quiet dignity, not stubbornness. She wasn't trying to manipulate anyone. She was simply holding her ground, allowing the evidence to speak for itself. The Admiral leaned toward the judge. He whispered something briefly, and the judge nodded. He then asked the engineer to describe Lena's demeanor during the rescue. The young woman hesitated, then said Lena had been calm, focused, and precise. She had issued commands without panic, ensured the safety of everyone aboard, and coordinated evacuation in a way that seemed almost effortless. She didn't hesitate, the witness said. Even when everything was falling apart, she stayed steady. She kept us alive. At that moment, a faint murmur of awe passed through the courtroom. People began to understand that the young woman, once restrained and condemned, might actually be a hero. Lena's tattoo, the symbol of her connection to a hidden operation, now made sense. It wasn't defiance, it was identification, proof of her involvement in something bigger than the court could have imagined. The Admiral remained quiet, but his expression was thoughtful. He had spent decades in service, but few times had he seen courage paired with such quiet strength. Lena had made impossible choices, taking responsibility that no one else could carry, and she had done it alone, knowing that revealing the truth could destroy careers, break families, or spark international scandal. The next part of the hearing introduced communications logs. The court examined transcripts showing that Lena had received and acted on a distress signal from the civilian ship. The signal had been encrypted, classified, and deliberately hidden from most of the naval chain of command. Lena had made a snap decision, choosing to trust the signal and act, despite knowing it would put her directly at odds with protocol. The prosecutor tried again to frame Lena's actions as reckless. She didn't have clearance for that transmission, she said. She disobeyed direct orders. She risked equipment and personnel. But the Admiral countered. His voice was calm but firm, carrying authority that filled the room. Her actions were calculated, necessary, and morally responsible. She knew what the consequences could be, but she acted to save lives that could not wait for permission. The courtroom was silent. The judge and jury could feel the weight of the statement. Lena remained quiet, but the energy around her shifted. She wasn't defying anyone now. She was simply herself, someone who had faced impossible choices and had chosen humanity over blind obedience. During the lunch break, the Admiral pulled Lena aside briefly. He didn't speak loudly, only in a voice that carried reassurance and respect. "I've reviewed everything," he said. You acted as few could with the courage of someone who understands the stakes. You kept people alive when no one else could. You did right. Lena nodded slightly, a shadow of relief crossing her face. She didn't need praise. She had never sought it, but acknowledgement from someone she respected, someone who understood the complexity and danger of the mission, felt different. It wasn't about glory. It was about being seen for what she had truly done. After the break, the court called an intelligence officer who had been involved in the broader mission. He testified about the covert nature of the operation Lena had interfered with, though interfered was a word that didn't fit. She had ensured the success of a hidden humanitarian mission, rescuing civilians with sensitive data. The officer explained that Lena's intervention had prevented disaster, even though no one else on the ship knew what she was trying to accomplish at the time. The audience in the courtroom leaned forward. The hidden details of Lena's actions began to emerge. Every choice she had made now appeared deliberate and precise. Her silence, once seen as stubbornness, now carried dignity. She had acted for the greater good, in a situation where every second mattered, and every decision could cost lives. The Admiral watched quietly, a mix of pride and relief in his eyes. He recognized the courage it took to make choices that no one else could understand. He knew the weight of the world that had rested on her shoulders during that night in the South Pacific. He also knew that she had carried the consequences alone, never seeking recognition, never expecting gratitude. The final witness of the day was a naval medic who had treated the civilians after their evacuation. She described how calm and efficient Lena had been, even when surrounded by chaos and fear. She stayed focused on keeping everyone alive, the medic said. I don't know how she did it. She didn't panic once. She just made the right decisions. Every word reinforced the truth. Lena hadn't acted recklessly. She had acted with precision, moral clarity, and courage. The courtroom, once ready to condemn her, now struggled to reconcile the charges with the reality being revealed. The prosecutor, now frustrated, attempted to shift the focus back to procedure. She argued that rules exist for a reason, and that Lena had broken them all. The Admiral raised his hand again. Sometimes the right choice isn't written in a manual, he said. Sometimes it must be made by someone who understands the consequences better than anyone else. Lena made that choice. A quiet hush fell over the room. People began to see the young woman differently. She was no longer just a defendant. She was someone who had acted under extreme pressure, with knowledge and courage that others could not comprehend. Her tattoo, now fully visible, no longer seemed like a mark of defiance. It was a symbol of responsibility, proof that she had been part of something bigger than herself. By the end of the day, the courtroom atmosphere had changed entirely. Lena remained quiet, her hands resting on the table. She hadn't celebrated, hadn't spoken out, but the energy around her had shifted. People respected her now. They could see the courage in her eyes, the weight she had carried, and the truth of her actions. The Admiral stayed after the proceedings, reviewing the case files again. He wanted to ensure that everything was accurate, that no misunderstanding could undo the progress that had been made. He knew the next steps would be critical. Lena's actions were heroic, but the world outside the courtroom might not yet understand the full story. Lena sat quietly, alone for a moment, thinking back to that night. She remembered the alarms, the panic, the sound of the waves crashing against both ships. She remembered the fear and the responsibility. She had made choices that night that could have cost her everything, yet somehow she had managed to save lives. And now finally, The morning light filtered into the courtroom through tall windows, casting long, pale beams across the polished wood floors. Lena sat at the table, her hands resting lightly in front of her, her posture calm but alert. She hadn't spoken much since the last session, but the courtroom seemed different now. The tension that had gripped everyone for weeks had shifted, replaced with curiosity and quiet respect. People were beginning to understand that the story they thought they knew was only half the truth. Admiral Kane was already in his seat, reviewing classified files that had been brought for the day's proceedings. His face was serious, but there was a glint of determination in his eyes. He had spent the night going over records, decoding signals, and cross-checking the details. Every time he glanced at Lena, he saw a young woman who had carried the weight of a secret mission alone, facing impossible choices that no one else could comprehend. The judge called the courtroom to order and the proceedings began. The first witness of the day was an intelligence analyst who had been monitoring communications during the time of the mission. She explained that a civilian vessel had been sending encrypted distress signals. The transmissions had been unusual, and they were not part of the official operation records. Only a handful of people had been aware of the signal, and Lena had been the one to act on it. The courtroom shifted uncomfortably. The prosecutor tried to argue that Lena had no right to respond to the signal. She said that following orders and maintaining protocol were what kept everyone safe, but the Admiral raised his hand. His voice was calm, deliberate, and filled with authority. Sometimes following orders can mean allowing harm to come to innocent people, he said. Lena acted with foresight and courage. She weighed the risk and chose the right path, even if it meant disobeying protocol. Lena didn't react outwardly, but a faint shift in her expression betrayed a small measure of relief. Someone finally understood. Someone in authority. Someone who had seen missions like hers before. Recognized that her actions were not reckless but necessary. The intelligence analyst continued, describing the contents of the civilian vessel. It had been carrying critical medical supplies, sensitive research materials, and 12 civilians whose lives were at risk. If Lena had followed the orders to return to base, those people would have been stranded, possibly lost. The documents provided proof, though much of it remained classified. The Admiral nodded quietly as the analyst spoke, recognizing the coordinates and the details of the operation. The prosecutor pressed the witness, attempting to frame Lena's actions as irresponsible. She acted without clearance, she said sharply. She took risks with Navy property and personnel. How can we condone that? The Admiral leaned forward, his gaze steady. She acted under extreme pressure with information that most of us were never given. She made decisions that saved lives. The risks you mentioned were calculated. She acted with precision, integrity, and courage. That is not irresponsibility. The courtroom remained silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Lena's tattoo, faint but visible now, seemed to glow in importance. The numbers and letters on her wrist weren't just marks. They were coordinates, proof of her involvement in a mission that most had never been aware of. The audience began to grasp the magnitude of what she had done. The next witness was a communications officer who had been on the naval ship with Lena. She described the chaos of the night. Alarms blaring, systems failing, crew members shouting orders over broken channels. She explained how Lena had taken control of the situation, directing the ship to the correct coordinates and keeping the civilians alive. The officer admitted she had doubted Lena at first, thinking she was defying orders out of arrogance. But as the night unfolded, she realized Lena's choices had been deliberate and life-saving. The courtroom was captivated. Witness after witness described Lena's focus, bravery, and decisiveness. Each testimony built a picture that contrasted sharply with the narrative of disobedience that had dominated the news and the prosecution's argument. It became clear that Lena hadn't acted recklessly. She had acted with extraordinary clarity and courage in a situation that no one else could have handled. After the witnesses, the court examined detailed mission logs and encrypted transmissions. Lena's lawyer presented evidence showing the exact path she had taken, the precise timing of her decisions, and the lives saved as a result. Every action was calculated, every decision justified. The prosecution tried to counter with questions about procedure, but the Admiral intervened. These logs, he said, pointing to the coordinates that matched Lena's tattoo, prove she acted under extreme circumstances with exceptional judgment. She had no choice but to take the course she did. The results were life-saving, and her actions were in line with the highest principles of service. The courtroom was hushed. People whispered among themselves, realizing that the young woman they had once seen as reckless might actually be a hero. Lena didn't celebrate or speak. She remained quiet, allowing the facts to speak for her. But inside, she felt the weight of years of isolation and misunderstanding begin to lift slightly. The Admiral requested a brief private meeting with the judge, reviewing certain classified documents in detail. He spoke quietly, pointing out the connections between Lena's decisions and the covert humanitarian mission. The judge listened, occasionally nodding, clearly impressed by the clarity and depth of Lena's actions. When they returned to the courtroom, the Admiral addressed everyone present. Lena's actions, he said, voice steady and authoritative, were not disobedience. They were courage under impossible conditions. She followed her instincts to protect innocent lives. That is not only commendable, it is the highest form of service. The audience shifted, a wave of recognition passing through the room. Even the prosecutor paused, seeing the depth of the situation and the evidence that had emerged. Lena remained quiet, her calm demeanor unchanged, but her eyes showed a glimmer of relief. She had carried this secret alone for years, and now someone powerful understood. The courtroom then reviewed additional reports from naval engineers and strategists. These reports confirmed that Lena's decisions prevented equipment failures from becoming catastrophic and ensured the safe evacuation of all civilians. Every choice she had made had been deliberate, precise, and morally grounded. Her silence and restraint had prevented misunderstandings, protected sensitive information, and saved lives. During the next recess, Lena sat quietly in the corner, reflecting on the past. She remembered the alarms, the panic, the decisions that had to be made in seconds. She thought about the people she had saved and the colleagues who had not known the full story. She had carried the burden of secrecy and the weight of responsibility for years. But now finally someone had seen it all. Someone had acknowledged the courage behind the silence. When the session resumed, the court called a medic who had treated the civilians after the rescue. She spoke about Lena's leadership and calm during the crisis. She didn't panic, the medic said. Even when everything was falling apart, she kept people alive. She gave orders, reassured the civilians, and made sure everyone was safe. I don't know how she did it, but she did. The courtroom was silent. Lena's calm, quiet presence contrasted with the chaos described in the testimonies. She had been poised, focused, and courageous when others would have faltered. Her tattoo, now fully visible, became a symbol of that courage, proof that she had been part of a mission that few could understand. The Admiral remained seated, his eyes fixed on Lena. He knew now that her silence had not been stubbornness but a necessary measure to protect lives and classified information. She had acted without expecting recognition, without hope of reward. She had done what was right, and that was all that mattered. As the day went on, more details of the mission were revealed. The civilian ship had been carrying sensitive medical research and critical humanitarian supplies. Lena's actions had prevented these materials from being lost, destroyed, or falling into the wrong hands. The consequences of her decisions were far-reaching, but she had acted decisively, prioritizing lives over protocol. By the end of the session, the courtroom atmosphere had completely transformed. Lena was no longer seen as reckless or defiant. She was recognized silently as someone who had made impossible choices with courage, integrity, and clarity. People whispered, acknowledging the heroism they had once overlooked. The Admiral reviewed the case files once more, confirming every detail. He understood that Lena's actions, while technically outside protocol, had been morally and strategically correct. He had seen countless operations in his career, but few displayed the combination of courage, intelligence, and moral judgment that Lena had shown. When the courtroom emptied for the day, Lena remained seated for a moment, quietly reflecting. She had carried the weight of misunderstanding, judgment, and isolation for years. But now, with witnesses and evidence confirming her decisions and with the Admiral recognizing her courage, she could feel a sense of validation. It was quiet, subtle, but profound. As she walked out of the courtroom, the murmurs of the audience followed her, a mixture of awe, respect, and newfound understanding. Lena didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her actions, her courage, and the weight of her secret mission spoke louder than